Well, it's great to have all of you with us today. My name is Chris, and we're in this series titled Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And it's actually based off of this book written by Andy Stanley. And the entire premise is that good questions lead to good decisions. And, well, we all want to make good decisions, don't we? Well, last week, Bevan did a fantastic job focusing in on the legacy question. And, well, this week, Ben, who leads our Grampian church, and he's focusing in on the conscience question. So here in a few moments, why don't you give Ben a warm TCC welcome.
Man, I'm excited to be with you here today. I want to start off with a question today. The question is this: why do drunk people make bad decisions? Now, I'm sure you have all kinds of ideas or even kind of theories on why drunk people make bad decisions. Maybe you think, well, maybe they just because they drank too much and that leads to bad decisions, but that's not really the real reason. But most of the time, right, we've all had those stories. Maybe you have some of those stories. We've heard those stories. In hindsight, we look back at some of those and we laugh. Some of them we don't laugh at so much. And then some are just, they're just kind of foggy in our brains and we don't really remember exactly what the night entailed. But here's one thing I do know. One thing I do know is I've never heard a person say, man, it's a good thing I was drunk. Otherwise, I might have made a really bad decision. Always, without fail, when I hear a drunk story or someone talk about how they got trashed, it always follows with a bad decision that was made. And so it comes back to this question: why do drunk people make bad decisions? Well, there's two really main reasons. You see, when someone puts a lot of alcohol in their body, it actually releases a lot of norepinephrine into their brain, and it acts as a stimulant. And the stimulants actually decrease kind of our cautious sense of what needs to happen. And so we become a lot more impulsive, we become a lot more risk-taking, and we're kind of shove off the things that say, hey, don't do that, that might lead to a bad decision. The second thing is this: it actually impairs the function of your prefrontal cortex. And your prefrontal cortex, well, that's the part of your brain that is the logical part, that connects all the dots, that is kind of the rational part. And it usually doesn't fully develop until you're about the age of 20 to 21. Or in my case, it's still getting there, but that's a different story. But it impairs that. And so really what happens is when you become more impulsive and less cautious. You become maybe a little bit louder and less quiet, and you are able to think, well, I'm just not going to make a decision based upon my conscience because, well, we've just suppressed it. It's not even there to make a decision or to guide us in that way. And so, drunk people make a lot of bad decisions. We're going to get more into that here in a second. But we're in this series right now called Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. And it's a series based off of a book by Andy Stanley, and it's has some great insights. And, over the past few weeks, we've learned some great things and have asked a couple of hard questions even in our own lives. And the underlying theme of this series, the underlying kind of thing we're looking at is that good questions lead to good decisions. And so when we ask ourselves good, hard, tough questions, and we answer those questions honestly, and then we act upon those questions based upon our honest answers, well, that's going to lead us to making better decisions in life and having fewer regrets in life. And as we look at that, right, it has huge implications for our lives because not only do our decisions affect us, we know that we've seen this, right, that we aren't the only people impacted by our decisions. Right? When we make a decision, and if it's a bad decision, it can have ripples effects to make and hurt other people or to cause them harm or dysfunction happen within those relational ideas. And so not only do our decisions not impact only us, it impacts other people, but our regrets also impact other people. And so as we allow those regrets to kind of weigh us down and kind of just put a burden upon us, it can actually affect our relationships with other people, it can reflect or affect our relationship with God, and cause more harm in our life than good. And as we looked at this series, and there's kind of one verse, and we learned this verse in week 1 when Dan shared with us, and it's Proverbs 27:12. It says, "The prudent sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty." And so we encourage you to memorize that verse, and I hope you had a chance to maybe start memorizing that, or maybe you already have it memorized. If you do, A+, good job. But we want to look at this because we know that the prudent, the wise, the people that kind of look at every situation, right? They see the danger and they take refuge and kind of avoid that. They ask themselves questions and make good decisions. But the simple, the foolish, the people that just kind of run through life without thinking of the consequences, well, they keep going and they pay the ultimate penalty in the end. And so Mike kicked off our first big question and shared with us the integrity question. Now, the integrity question was this: am I being honest with myself? With everything that's going on, am I truly being honest with myself? Do I have the resources to do that? Do I have the social capacity or the intelligence to do something? Am I being honest with myself when I'm faced with a decision, whether it's a personal decision, whether it's a work decision, whether it's a relational decision, whatever that is? Am I being honest with myself in what is going on in that situation or that environment? And then Bevan last week shared with us the legacy question. And that question was, what story do I want to tell? And so when we look at our lives, right, we have to kind of look it down and kind of narrow it down to the story that we're telling, the story that we're writing in our lives. And we have to realize that ultimately a lot of what we do has a great impact on how our story is written. And so what story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell a good story where you're the hero of your story and that you leave a legacy for other people to be pointed towards Jesus and allow him to work in your life? Or are you telling a different story, a story that's opposite of that is riddled with bad decisions and riddled with poor choices? And so what story do we want to tell? Which ultimately leads us to our question today, which is the conscience question. The conscience question. You see, going back to our initial question of why do drunk people make bad decisions, they make bad decisions because they've kind of given up their right to have a conscience. They've impaired their ability to even figure out what is leading me to make these decisions. Now, the bad side of that is they have an excuse, right? They can say, well, I didn't know. It was impaired. I shut that part of my brain off. But when we're sober, right, well, when we kind of ignore those internal and external cues, we're choosing just to not even pay attention to it. I mean, we know it's there. We know there's something in our life that's saying, hey, this isn't quite right, but I'm going to choose to ignore it. I'm going to continue to kind of rush through life and make those decisions anyways. And so when we make bad decisions in sobriety, well, that's on us. And that's something that we have to own. And so usually when we come up with a situation or something that's kind of affecting us, well, you feel this tension. And so this question for the conscious question is there tension that deserves my attention? Is there tension that deserves my attention? When I come into a situation or even a work situation or a family situation and I'm trying to make a decision, well, sometimes I just get this gut feeling, right? This tension builds up with me and something that tells me that this is just not right. Some people refer to it as a red flag moment. A red flag moment. What's that red flag that goes up that kind of draws your attention to the situation that you're in? What I like to say, I just say, hey, well, it's kind of, there's something wonky here, right? Or there's something sketch going on that I don't quite understand what it is, or I don't quite understand why I'm getting this feeling, but there's something within me that's causing me to rethink this decision, to rethink the decision I'm trying to make. And so whatever you call it, whether it's red flag, wonky sketch, whatever it is, you know what I'm talking about, right? That kind of inner deep down feeling you get when something's not right. So we need to pay attention to this tension. We need to pay attention to this tension. And so maybe you're thinking even, well, I'm not a person that just makes decisions based upon my emotions. Like, I'm going to look at the facts. I'm going to connect all my dots. I'm going to cross every T and dot every I, and I'm going to figure out the best decision based upon the facts. But the thing is, that's not even true. You see, there's this guy named Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And in his book, what they ended up finding was that when you ask somebody a moral question, and then you measure their brain activity and their response rate, what they found out is that people actually make a decision very quick. And then they take the time to justify that decision after they've made it. And so what he's saying is, look, we're met with moral questions in our life all the time. We're met with situations that we're going to answer quickly based upon our values, based upon our cultural upbringing, based upon our belief system, or whatever it is, maybe even kind of our natural wiring to an extent, right? Whatever those is, we're going to make those decisions quick, and then we're going to find reasons to justify that decision later. And also what we know from brain experts and neurological experts is that feeling we get, that kind of gut feeling, that red flag moment that we get, is actually a different part of our brain that's firing, saying, hey, there's something not right about this. You need to pay attention. And it's trying to kind of bring us back down to earth so we can make an informed decision based upon what's laid out before us. So it's not even just making a decision based upon emotions. It's not a feeling thing where, well, I'm not going to make this decision because I have a gut feeling about it, but it's something that God's placed in us that says, hey, slow down, take a break, think about what's going on, pay attention to that tension. And then we have this situation as well, right? And maybe it's not even our own internal dialogue. Maybe somebody in your life comes along and says, hey, that's a great idea, but have you thought about this? And then that tension raises up. And it's usually moms, right? Moms are great at that. You know, moms are always like, hey, that's a great idea, but it's illegal. You can't really do that. And so people like that come into our lives, and we have to figure out, well, what's that tension coming from? Maybe it's even in the workplace, right? Like you're thinking of an idea, or maybe you think of a new way to make something better, to produce something, and a coworker says, hey, that's a great idea, but have you told the boss about it yet? Or have you made that decision yet? Or have you figured out all these kind of ethical dilemmas yet? And you just kind of get that pit in your stomach that you say, well, maybe I do need to rethink that. Or, probably like most of us, we have a tendency to dodge the truth by discounting the truth teller. And so if you're like me, man, someone comes and says, hey, that's a great idea, but have you thought about this thing that causes tension? I'm like, what do they know? They don't know me. They don't know my level of intelligence. They've never walked in my shoes. I mean, even look at their life and what they produce. It's nothing compared to what I've done. And so I discount maybe the truth they're trying to speak into my life, or the truth that God is using in them to speak into our life, by trying to discount them. But what we're getting down to short is, usually if something is bothering you, let it bother you. Right? Let it kind of fester within you until you can figure out, why is this bothering me? Why is this situation, or whatever is around the situation, what is in it that is creating that tension within me? And pay attention to the tension. Just pay attention to the tension that comes up. And we actually see a really great narrative of King David. King David was Israel's second king, and he was a king that followed after God and did what was right in the eyes of God. But before he became king, he was just a shepherd. And he had many brothers who were older and stronger than he was. But at one point in time, God's like, you know what? I have this king right now. His name's King Saul, but he's not doing a great job, so I need to put a new king in place. And so he sent a prophet to David's family, and David was told that he would be anointed king, and he was anointed king, and he would be king one day, but he wasn't king yet. He had to wait till King Saul was done. Well, as David continued to grow up, he became very famous. Many of you, even if you haven't been around church, you've heard the story of David and Goliath. So David rises up and he defeats the giant Philistine named Goliath, and Israel is super excited, and David starts becoming a legend. He starts becoming this warrior. He starts becoming this leader, and he starts gaining a lot of influence. And, King Saul is not too happy about this. And King Saul, actually, he's so jealous and so envious of David that he decides, I just need to kill David and get him out of the equation so I can remain king. And so that causes David to have to run into the wilderness and to flee as a fugitive of the law. But because of his leadership and his influence, he starts gathering a group of people. And it's not even that hard. People hear of the legends of David and all the great stories and the heroic things that he's done and the leadership that he's providing. And they've even heard that, he's been anointed king, so he's going to be king someday. And so they start flocking to him. And he eventually ends up with his own small army. So this small army is just wandering around in the wilderness, hiding from King Saul, trying to avoid getting killed. And one day, King Saul gets some pretty good intel. And King Saul says, hey, I got him now. I got him cornered. And he amasses 3,000 men, and he sets out into the wilderness and looking for David and his men. And as they're searching and they're walking around, it's just in this Middle Eastern terrain of caves and desert and wilderness, and they're kind of walking through it. And, well, Saul has to relieve himself, right? He has to use the bathroom. And so he dismounts from his mule and he goes and finds this cave. And he walks into this cave to relieve himself, and wouldn't you know it, he walks into the very cave that David is hiding in with some of his men. And so, I mean, just imagine that, right? Here's this guy that's searching for you, trying to kill you, trying to get you out of the equation so he doesn't have to give up his kingship. And so, and you can't fulfill what God's called you to do or anointed you to do. And here comes King Saul walking into this cave. And I can imagine David's getting a little nervous. His men are getting a little nervous as they see this silhouette walking in, and they realize it's King Saul, the man hunting them down. And as they see him walk in, David and his men, well, they retreat a little further back into the cave. And then everyone gets kind of excited when they realize what King Saul is doing. Right? He's coming in to relieve himself. He's coming in unarmed, and he's coming in without his men because he needs privacy, right? You wouldn't want to watch the king do his business. That would be disrespectful. So he's coming into nothing guarding him. This is his chance. Right? Now you can imagine that even David, who wasn't king yet, but David's men were like, hey, man, David, this is your chance. Right? We've been wandering around in this wilderness. If we take care of this problem right now, we can go home. And we actually know that because as the narrative continues in 1 Samuel 24:4, it says this, his men are talking to David, and they say, this is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, I will give you your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. So like, David, this is the chance, man. This is our ticket home. This is so that we don't have to continue running. We don't have to continue hiding in the wilderness. And so David gets out his dagger. And he quietly starts approaching King Saul with every intention, I'm sure, to slit his throat. And let's be honest, that'd be a horrible way to go. Like, if I could think of, like, top 5 reasons of how I'd want to die, dying while using the bathroom is up there for sure. Like, it'd be horrible. And King David, he's getting there, and he's walking up to him, and all of a sudden he feels this tension. Right? This thing that's, something's not quite right. Again, it's going against all logic. It's going against everything that his men are encouraging him to do. Because David's thinking this, right? And everyone's thinking this, right? Hey, kill the king, be the king. Kill the king, become the king. And so David's like, if I just take care of this, I'll become king. I'll become what God's anointed me to be. And his men are like, hey, if you do this, David, you'll become king. You'll become what God appointed you to be. But he has this tension rise up, and he starts thinking to himself. And here's something where we can relate to David as well. Right? The thing with David is that we have to realize that oftentimes we don't pay attention to the tension because we believe we can predict the future. We believe we can know what the outcome is going to be. And I don't know about you, but usually when I try to predict the future, I'm never right. I always make a bad decision, or something always goes wrong. I mean, you ever been disappointed? I mean, what is disappointment? Disappointment's mispredicting the future. When you've planned everything out and then stuff doesn't go according to plan, you're disappointed. So David feels this tension welling up within him, and he realizes, like, if I continue to go through this, well, just because I kill the king doesn't necessarily mean I'll become the king right then. Just because I do what people are encouraging me to do, just because my men are behind me and rallying me to do this, well, it doesn't actually mean that what I think is going to happen is going to happen. And the author tells us that David was conscience-stricken. And this is how we know he's kind of paying attention to that tension that's welling up within him. And David starts thinking, well, who put King Saul in his place? Who anointed Saul to be on the throne? He's like, well, God did. And who am I to play God? Who am I to remove Saul on my own? Like, it's not like we're in a battle. It's not like we're combating to the death right now. I mean, this would be straight up murder, just as he's doing his business. And so who am I to take that responsibility on and to do only what God has planned to do? Because I don't really know what the outcome is going to be. So what does David do? Well, he sneaks up a little bit closer and he cuts off a corner of King Saul's robe. He turns around quietly and heads back to his men. And you can imagine the expressions on their face were just shock and surprise and disgust. And David, this was our chance to get home, and you didn't kill him. I mean, he was right at your fingertips. It could have been done. So David has some explaining to do. So it continues on in verse 6, and it says, David tells his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed." And I'm sure his men were getting upset, and they probably were like, "Well, David, if you're not going to do it, have one of us do it. We'll go do it. We don't have a conscience. We'll take care of the guy. If you don't want blood on your hands, we'd be more than happy to have blood on our hands." And in verse 7, it says that David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. So Saul walks out of the cave, pulls up his robe, and joins his men. He gets back on his mule, and as he's about to head out, he hears his name being called from above. And he looks up, and there's David, standing in the mouth of this cave that he just came out of to do his business. And David's sitting there, and he's saying, "Look, I had the opportunity to kill you, but I didn't. I had the opportunity to take matters into my own hands, but I didn't." And he holds up that piece of robe. And Saul looks at his, and sure enough, it's from his robe. And Saul realizes how close David was and how much jeopardy his life was actually in. And any other situation, Saul would have killed David hands down, no problem, cut his throat, done. But David says, "No, I'm not going to take that responsibility on." And then he says this powerful statement that I think we should all take to heart. He says this statement to Saul. He says, "May the Lord judge between you and me." May the Lord judge between you and me. Look, it's not up for me to decide what's going to happen. It's not up for me to play God. It's not up for me to take away what God has put in place. Well, it's up to me is for God to figure out the outcome of this situation. I'm listening to that tension within me, and it's God telling me that He's got this under control. And God did have it under control. See, a few months, a couple chapters later, we see that Saul is on a battlefield. And this random, not even named person in the Philistine army, an archer who's standing behind the infantry line, shoots off an arrow, just at random, right? Just trying to hit somebody that's coming towards him. And that arrow finds its way and finds a seam in Saul's armor and mortally wounds him. Of course, Saul doesn't want to die at the hands of his enemies, so he takes his sword out and he falls upon his sword. And as soon as the word gets back to the kingdom, the people anoint David as king, and he raises up to the position that God anointed him to have. And I'm sure that would have been great for David to know in the cave, right? I'm sure David was like, "Man, God, if you would have just told me that this was going to happen a couple chapters later, that would have been fantastic. Like, that would have made my decision a lot easier. That would have made me say, well, I'm just going to let God take care of it. I'm going to stay back because I know, well, an arrow's going to hit him in a couple months. No big deal." But David didn't know that. He couldn't predict the future. He couldn't know what was going to happen. But because of his decision, he was able to write his story the way he wanted it to be told. Because who wants to tell the story of, hey, gather your kids and your grandkids around and say, "Hey, well, I became king because I killed the king while he was popping a squat." That's not a very brave story. It's not a very heroic story. It's kind of cowardly. But the story of saying, "Hey, I had this decision to make, and this tension welled up within me, and I knew that there was something wrong with that I had to pay attention to this tension that was within me, and so I held off, and I let God take care of it. And when I let God take care of it, well, I don't have to live with the regrets that I could have had. I don't have to live with the regrets of being a murderer or removing what God had put in place, but I can allow God to bring me up to the spot where He wants me to be." And so we have to continue to ask us that question. Is there tension that deserves your attention? Is there tension that deserves your attention? Is there relational tension? Is there financial tension? Is there social tension? Whatever it is there tension that deserves your attention? You see, I remember one time when I was in 7th grade, I decided to try out for basketball, which was a horrible idea because I was horrible at basketball. Like, they had the first string team, the second string team, then they had this third string team that had some alternates that would like go to some of the games. That was the place I was at. I was one of the alternates. And so I was not good at basketball, but it was a good experience. And I remember one day at basketball practice, here's a bunch of 7th grade boys. We're getting excited, and our school had just built this new gym. And at this new gym, they were taking turns for the girls' team to practice, and then the next week the boys' team would have it. And we hadn't had a chance to practice in the new gym yet, so we're getting really excited because we show up Monday morning. It's our day to practice in the new gym. And so we're all sitting in the old gym waiting to be taken over by our coach, and our coach comes out, and he says, hey, we're going to go over to the new gym here in a minute, but first, before we do that, I need to go into my office, which was underneath, the stadium bleachers. It was like one of those cool old school coach offices in the old gym. He said, I need to go to my office. I need to make a couple phone calls, and then we'll go over to the new gym. But don't go over until I come back out and take you over there. So we're all sitting there, and of course, we're getting jittery. We're getting excited about going over to the new gym, right? To us, it was like state-of-the-art facility. It was going to be amazing. And we're sitting there waiting, and eventually a couple of guys, they just couldn't wait any longer. And so they pop up and say, hey, we're going over to the new gym. We're going to start practicing. Let's go. So they head off, and of course, one by one, and then of course, two by two. And all of a sudden, everyone stands up and heads over to the new gym. And I stand up, and I'm getting ready, and I'm starting to walk down the old gym and to head that way. And then all of a sudden, I just get this feeling like, wait a minute. Coach said we got to stay here until he takes us over there. And I'm not a rule breaker. Like, it makes me a little bit nervous to break the rules. So I decided, hey, I'm going to sit back down. I'm going to wait on my coach. So I sit back down, just me, by myself, waiting. He's taking a long time. A couple minutes pass. Couple more minutes pass. I'm getting anxious because I'm the only one sitting here. Should I have gone? Should I have stayed? I don't know. So I get up. I walk down the bleacher steps, knock on my coach's office. He says, come in. I say, hey, coach, can we go over to the new gym yet? No, don't go to the new gym yet. Wait till I come get you. And I say, well, too late because everyone already went over there. And, of course, he gets mad. He gets angry. He gets upset. And he said, come on, we're going over there. So we walk over there. He starts yelling and getting on to everyone who went over there. And he said, okay, all you guys have to run suicides now, which if you've never run a suicide, they're horrible. But all you have to run suicide except for Ben because he followed directions. So I sat on the sideline, and I just watched all my teammates run until they looked like they were going to puke. And by the time they got tired and exhausted, well, hey, practice was over because we spent all our time running. And that's a simple situation, right? But here's what I know. In our lives, we are confronted with situations somewhere between listening to simple instructions from your coach and killing the king. And whatever that situation is in your life, whatever comes up in your life that you realize, hey, there's some tension that is involved around this decision. There's something bothering me about this. Maybe I should listen. Because often it's maybe God's way of telling you that there's something different he has planned. Or maybe there's something that you haven't thought of yet. Or maybe there's a better course that you don't know is an opportunity yet. And so we want to sit in that tension and figure out, why is there tension in my life about this? Whether it's family tension, relational tension, work tension, or just everyday tension. Or we know we're going to face those situations that are going to cause us to think hard and long about why we are making this decision. And we're going to pick more up on that next week as we look at the maturity question. But before we head out, I want to leave you with one question. It's out of this verse, the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. The question is this: do you sense danger ahead? Is there alarms going off in your head? Is the Lost in Space robot going off in your head telling you that there's danger coming? And do we think, well, maybe I should hold up? Because what we know from the verse in Proverbs is that, hey, the simple people, right? They might sense danger, but they're going to barrel on through. They're going to end up living lives full of regrets, full of bad decisions, and bad decisions that don't only affect them, but ripple out and affect the people around them, and the regrets affect them and the people around them. But if we really want to be prudent, we want to be wise, if we want to lean into what God is saying, and we sense danger, we'll lean into that tension and figure out what needs your attention. Let's pray. God, we just thank you for who you are and just the way that you've created us to sense and to know that maybe something's off about something. That when we come up into a situation that maybe we don't have all the facts, we don't have all the knowledge, or maybe there's just something, just some inner feeling that we don't know why it's there, but there's some tension there that, God, you'll just allow us to pay attention to the tension in our lives. God, that we won't just try to push it aside or brush it away or just figure out, you know what, we'll figure this out later and just make that decision. But God, that you'll allow us to pause and think and figure out, why is this tension being created? God, that ultimately we will know and have assurance that you are in charge, and that God, you have mapped out what needs to happen. And that we will trust in you and lean into you and not take matters into our own hands, but know that you are in control. And as we trust in where you lead us, God, that we know that we can live life that is full of less regrets. And that we can make better decisions that set up future generations to make better decisions as well. So give us wisdom, allow us to be prudent, and allow us to lean into your sovereignty. We just pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.